Good evening, my friends. Welcome to Outlandish Talmud Stories and Outstanding Life Lessons, Class 21. Tonight's topic is All Grown Up at 40. I want to thank Trina London for dedicating tonight's class in commemoration of her grandmother's yard site, Manya Bat Trina Zichronah Livracha, may her neshama have aliyah, be a great source of merit and blessing for you, your family, and for us all. And if you'd like to dedicate a class, there's a link in the description near your video, and we'd be very grateful if you can help support our work. Tonight's source sheet you can download, there's a link there as well by the video description. So, all grown up at 40. It's something that's on my mind. It's a personal thing because I happen to, in less than 24 hours, begin to be celebrating my 40th birthday. So that's very exciting, a little nerve-wracking. But we know that birthdays, besides being personal simchas and personal milestones, birthdays are also, the way the Jewish view is, it's a day of great gratitude and thinking that we've come to this world, we've joined the community of the Jewish people, the community of the human race, and Hashem has sent us down to this world to be part of the army, be part of the people, and do what we have to do. So it's a simcha, it's a joy for everybody. And we also believe that it's not just a day for receiving gifts, receiving blessings, receiving good wishes, but it's a day for giving, because our mazal, our great fortune, our stars in heaven are shining, so we have the chance to give and to bless to others. So what I want to do is use this opportunity to teach with you and share and invite you in this conversation about the significance of the number 40. You know, turning 40 for many people is a challenging milestone in life, and some people feel that life is over at 40, and some people feel that life is just beginning at 40. It's neither, but 40 is definitely a significant stage in life's journey, as we're going to discover today. But not just in life's journey, 40 is a number, as we'll see soon, that is very prevalent throughout Jewish history, Jewish texts, Jewish law, Jewish mysticism. And I want to explore with you tonight the significance of the number 40, and whether it's the age 40, whether you're in that category a little more or a little less, or other areas of life where you can reflect on the number 40 in your life, you'll discover its power, its potency, and how it can truly be the unique attribute that it is in your life. So first, with a little humor, I was gathering some quotes to think about the number 40. So as one writer once wrote, "Life begins on your 40th birthday, but so do fallen arches, rheumatism, faulty eyesight, and the tendency to tell a story to the same person 3 or 4 times." Someone else once said, "You're not 30. After 38 and 39, you're turning 30-10. Maybe that's a better way of looking at it. Age is strictly a case of mind over matter. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter." As Charles Schultz, the famous cartoonist, wrote, he once said, "Just remember, once you're over the hill, you begin to pick up speed." Middle age is when a guy keeps turning off lights for economical rather than romantic reasons. Carl Jung once wrote, "Life really does begin at 40. Up until then, you're just doing research." Famous quote that says, "At age 20, we worry about what others think of us. At age 40, we don't care what others think of us. At age 60, we discover they haven't been thinking of us at all." Victor Hugo once wrote, 40 is the old age of youth. 50 is the youth of old age." And finally, old age is like everything else. To make a success of it, you need to start young. So I think it's a nice collection of humor and some serious aphorisms to understand age and experience and the journey in life. So we're going to try to explore the significance of the number 40 in life. Let's turn to the source sheet, and I hope you've downloaded it. And the truth is, a bit of a confession, we don't really have an outlandish Talmud story for tonight. Instead, this is more of a class, a classic Talmudic class that has certainly some outlandish ideas and some outstanding ideas. So we will encounter some stories and some amazing teachings, and I hope we'll come away with something I've been researching for quite some time now, something remarkable that we can all take to heart and to our lives to make the improvements and tap into the blessings that are available as we'll be describing. So on side number one, quote, source number one, I sat down and I asked myself a question. Where do we find the number 40 in the span of Jewish literature, Jewish history? And I racked my brain and I did my research. Where do we have the number 40? And I came up with quite a few results. I don't think I've exhausted the entire list. I'm sure there are more, but let's review just some of the very different examples of the number 40 that are used, but I want to be able to tie it all in at the end, which is going to be the amazing part of this whole class. So let's go through these examples. The Talmud says that Rabbi Chisda taught. They said the formation of a fetus in a woman takes 40 days. So when a woman conceives a baby, we're told, as the Talmud says, up until 40 days, the baby is not really considered a fetus. In the language of the Talmud, it's called maya ba'alma. It's just like water, which means it's still not a viable fetus yet. Doesn't even have a gender yet, according to the Talmud. And only after 40 days does it become a fetus. And this is actually a relevant law with regards to possible options of abortion if they become necessary. So definitely the discussion pre and post the 40 days of conception is a very important one, because the 40 days is a landmark stage in the evolution of the fetus. Then we know, just scientifically, that human pregnancy lasts approximately 40 weeks. So again, 40 in the process of birth. We have very early on in the Torah, in the episode of Noah and the flood, we know that it rained steadily and constantly for 40 days and 40 nights. Now we know the flood lasted for many more months after that, but that's because it took a long time for the rain waters to recede. But the actual rain was for 40 days and 40 nights. We also know with regards to the law of a mikveh. A mikveh is that pool, body of water that a person immerses in, or a utensil or a garment or something that is impure immerses in order to become pure. What is the status of a kosher mikveh? How much water is required for a kosher mikveh? So the law of the Talmud says you need to have 40 sa'ah of water. Sa'ah is a particular measurement. If you have 40, which that was the number estimated to fit in the average human body. So the number for a mikveh is 40 sa'ah of water. By the way, there are those that connect this measurement of 40 sa'ah of water of a mikveh to the 40 days and nights of the rain of the flood. It's apparently there was some kind of mikveh purification process going on in the world with the flood waters. Next, you know the famous story of Abraham. Abraham was raised in a pagan home, an idolatrous home, and somehow, as the Medrash teaches, as he was growing up, he rejected the path of his fathers and his family and his community, and he started to discover and he started to wonder there must be a central, higher body that is orchestrating, operating everything in the world, and he starts to begin to discover there's a God, there's one God in the universe. Now, at what age was that discovery? So there are different opinions about this, and it seems like it was an evolution. He was slowly coming to that discovery in a maturer and maturer way. But Maimonides, the Rambam, writes as follows. Abraham was 40 years old when he became aware of his creator. 40, he discovered God. Next, we know that once God gave the Torah, the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai, and everybody was there, Moses was top of the mountain, Moses came down the mountain to teach the Torah, he goes back up to receive the rest of the Torah. How long does Moses go up the mountain for? Have a guess? 40 days and 40 nights. And actually he does this 3 times. He comes home back down after 4 days and 40 nights. He sees the golden calf, so he breaks the tablets. He goes back up for another 4 days and 40 nights to ask for atonement for God. God wanted to destroy the Jewish people. And then he goes up for a third time, 40 days and 40 nights, to receive the second set of tablets. Which that leads to the next point. There are 40 days from Rosh Chodesh Elul until Yom Kippur. So we know coming to the high holiday season, it's a season of change, of renewal, of teshuvah, of reflection. So it pretty much the beginning of the month of Elul, which is the last month of the year, we start to take it seriously and begins a process. We talk about the 1 month before the high holidays, but really it's the 40 days from Rosh Chodesh Elul, the beginning of Elul, until the end of the high holidays, which is Yom Kippur. Those 40 days are very significant. They're actually the 40 days of the third journey of Moses on Mount Sinai. So Moses arrives back down from the mountain for the third and final time with the second set of tablets on Yom Kippur. So it's a 40-day journey throughout the high holidays. In the desert, the Jews wander in the desert for 40 years before coming into Israel. Let's go to some Torah law. So there's one of the penalties that a person could get for performing a sin was the penalty of lashes. That someone from the Beis Din, from the court, was ordered to whip you. How many lashes did a person get? So the maximum amount of lashes, if you were healthy enough, because the lashes were not meant to kill you, they were just meant to punish you and basically to make sure you never do it again. So how many lashes? So the Torah says lashes are arba'im chaser achat, 40 minus 1 lashes. In other words, the maximum amount of lashes you can get is 39 if you're healthy. If you're not so healthy, the doctor will check you out. You may get less, 30, 20, 10, 5, whatever you can handle. But lashes are 40 minus 1. But it's really 39. Why does the Torah use the language 40 minus 1? So strange. But again, the number 40 is being used in reference to lashes. A similar term is used with regards to Shabbat and with regards to the Mishkan. So we know that the Torah says you cannot perform any prohibited labor on Shabbat. What's a prohibited labor? So the Torah juxtaposes the forbidding labor on Shabbat with the construction of the tabernacle of the Mishkan in the desert. Therefore, the sages understood that this is teaching us that whatever labor, whatever work went into constructing the Mishkan, that's called constructive work, and it's that work which is prohibited on Shabbat. What kind of labor? How many categories of labors went into constructing the Mishkan? Again, the rabbis identified 40 minus 1, which is really 39. There are 39 categories of labor which went into constructing the tabernacle, which is why there are 39 prohibited categories of labor on Shabbat. But it's not called 39 in the law, in the Talmud. It's called 40 minus 1. Again, the number 40. Why such a strange term? Rabbi Akiva, the great sage, was spoken about many, many times towards in the first and second century. We're told that for Rabbi Akiva's first 40 years of his life, he was illiterate, he was an ignoramus, he never got a chance to study. Then, with the support of his wife and with the story that happened, if you recall, the raindrops on the rock, he had an epiphany. I too can change. And so he spends the next 40 years immersed in studying and growing. And then he spends the last 40 years of his life teaching and being a leader for the Jewish people. So he lived 120 years in those increments of 40. When Rabbi Zera wanted to learn the Jerusalem version of the Talmud, he fasted 40 times. This, by the way, maybe I shouldn't have put in there because it might not be so accurate. It's not clear if it's 40 times or 100 times. Rabbi Zera was a sage from Babylon, and he was fully well-versed in Babylonian Talmud. But he wanted to make Aliyah, move to Israel and study Jerusalem Talmud. And he, for whatever reason, I need to think about this, he said, I need to forget all of my learning, forget Babylonian Talmud in order to remember and be able to absorb and understand Jerusalem Talmud. Now, that's not normally how things go. In other words, if you're pursuing a certain new degree, a new course of study, you'll probably fall back on your previous learning and training to help you understand and learn more about the new thing. Rabbi Zera said, I have to actually forget what I know previously to attain my new knowledge. Why that is, we need to think about that. But he fasts several fasts. So it's not, in the Talmud, there might be a mem. A mem stands for 40, or might be mem standing for me'ah. Me'ah means 100. So that might be that he fasted 40 or 100 fasts to forget his learning. One final example that I've brought on the sheet, and like I said, I'm sure there are many more, and I'm curious if some of you could provide more examples of 40. But this is very interesting. A proclamation was issued in all the shuls of Prague in 1786 under the instruction of the chief Rabbi, the Noda Yehuda, banning the publication of commentaries on Talmud or Halacha written by anyone under the age of 40. That's a quote from a great rabbi. This was a time, just to give some historical context, where there were two things the rabbis were trying to address. Number one, reckless Torah study, reckless commentaries, reckless people stepping up as leaders that they weren't worthy of being that. So they made the law, no printing books until you're 40 years old. Until you're 40, we don't want to hear from you. Number one. They were also, at that time, trying to limit or control the study of Kabbalah, the study of mysticism. And it doesn't say this about mysticism. People think it says that you can't study Kabbalah until you turn 40. It doesn't actually say that anyway. But it does say you should not study Kabbalah until you have a significant experience and background in the Talmud and Jewish law and many other more obvious Jewish texts. And so an estimation was made, perhaps 40 is the right age. So they were making these laws to try to control and hold on to, preserve the quality and the integrity of the Torah. So they said no printing books until you are 40 years old. So that's an introduction that shows you that the number 40 comes across many times with regards to many things. And the question that I want to explore with you today is, what is it about the number 40? And is there a connection between all of these different historical anecdotes, laws, scientific phenomenon? Is there any connection that links all of these ideas that the number 40 is deliberately being used in all of these situations? Let's try to figure this out together. Okay, so let's turn over, and we have a few sources that we're going to be studying through tonight. We're going to be addressing another issue of 40, which I did not put on the list because this is the content of tonight's text, and then we're going to expand this and try to understand this together. Our first quote is quote number 2 from Talmud Sotah, page 22a and b. Let's read it. The Talmud asks, what is the meaning of a child whose months of gestation were not completed? Previously in the Talmud has spoken about a few different kinds of people who their actions bring destruction to the world, bring moral destruction, spiritual destruction. It's sort of very depraved kinds of people. One of the categories of these people who bring destruction to the world are children or people who haven't completed their months of gestation. Now, there's a metaphoric concept being expressed over here. Who's the kind of person who has not completed the months of gestation? So there's a number of suggestions in the Talmud. Rabbi Abba, he gives the following suggestion. This refers to a student who has not yet attained the ability to issue halachic rulings, and yet he issues rulings, and is therefore compared to a prematurely born child. Similar to the concern we said earlier, somebody who is stepping up to serve as a Jewish leader, to offer opinions and rulings in Jewish law, but they're not cut out for it, or they're not ready for it. And so it's like premature gestation. It's a birth. It's unripe. It's not healthy. The thing that this person is saying, it's not to be relied upon. This is as Rabbi Abahu says, that Rav Huna says, that Rav says, the following source for the teaching. What is the meaning of that which is written in the book of Proverbs, in the book of Mishlei, chapter 7, verse 26? King Solomon says the following, for she has cast down many wounded, and a mighty host are all her slain. King Solomon is simply referring to the power of a harlot, and someone who can have a negative influence and can bring down the seductive forces of such a person that can bring down anybody from the highest of places. So she cast down many that become wounded, and many become slain by her might. But there's something metaphoric over here, says Rabbi Abahu. So he explains. There's two parts to the verse. The first part of the verse that says, for she has cast down many wounded. So the Hebrew for the word cast down is hipila. Hipila also can mean a miscarriage. This is referring to a Torah scholar who has not yet attained the ability to issue rulings, and yet he issues rulings. A person who causes wounds is somebody who speaks up with opinions and ideas and rulings and has no right, no authority, no significant background to be able to be expressing and sharing these things. So when you say something that is probably not fully true or not fully developed, you could be wounding people because you're misguiding them, because you're speaking up and claiming some kind of authority when really you don't have it. That's the mistake of somebody who should not be ruling, and yet they do rule. The second part of the verse is the other way around. The mighty hosts are all her slain. So in Hebrew, it's the word va'atzumim, which means mighty, but va'atzumim has another meaning. It can mean closed. Atzum einayim, close your eyes. What does it mean, those that are closed? This refers to a Torah scholar who has attained the ability to issue rulings. They're wise, they're prominent, they're reliable, they're authoritative, they're knowledgeable, but they do not issue rulings because they're humble, or they say, who am I? And that prevents the masses from learning Torah properly. The other way around, when somebody is capable of being a teacher and capable of imparting and sharing and teaching wisdom, but for whatever reason they don't, they're closing the eyes of society, they're closing the hearts, they're closing opportunities for people to learn, to study, and to grow. So now we've discovered that there are people who are not worthy of being leaders, rabbis, halachic decisors, and if they do so, something very wrong with them. As the Talmud says, they bring destruction to the world, they bring wound. So the Talmud asks a question, and until when is it considered too premature for a scholar to issue halachic rulings? How do we know when a person is ready? And the Talmud gives the answer. The answer is until you're 40 years. That's the answer. Until 40 years, you're not supposed to be stepping up to be in the position of leadership and halachic ruling. After 40 years, then you may, and if you're able to, then you must. Here becomes a matter of great dispute among two great commentaries. What is the meaning of this verse, that until 40 years, you're not supposed to be making these rulings? Rashi, you've all heard of Rashi. His name is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. So Rashi is the acronym of his name. 12th century, great sage, who wrote the famous commentary on the Chumash, on the Torah and Tanakh. And then he wrote a commentary on Talmud, and he wrote many other works. So Rashi is a very authoritative commentary. Rashi says it means when a person turns 40 years old. The age until 40 years means until you turn 40 years old. Until 40 years old, you should not be in a position of leadership and being of an influence to others. After 40, you can and you may and you must. Rashi has a source, a very strong source to support what he says. What's that strong source? It's the next Mishnah. It's the next quote on your page. It's quote number 3. It's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot Ethics of Our Fathers. It's a very famous Mishnah, chapter 5, Mishnah 22. The Mishnah, interestingly, goes through, it's a very interesting Mishnah. It goes through all the ages of life, ages and stages of how and when you should be accomplishing and mapping out the life of your children or your life. Listen, we'll read some of it together because it's good to know. So the Mishnah says when a 5-year-old is the proper age to start studying scripture. I don't think they study scripture with 5-year-olds today, but they should. So we have to think about that. It doesn't start at 5, it starts at 0. What are we doing with our children at 0, 1, and 2? Can they be ready at 5 years old to study scripture? Then at 10 years old, they already know all of scripture, so they start to study Mishnah. At 13, which is the bar mitzvah, or 12, the bat mitzvah for the girl, they start to observe mitzvot. They become bound by the duties of a responsible Jewish adult. 15, they study Talmud. 18, you get married. Of course. It's much easier that way. Later it becomes more difficult. 20, you start to pursue a livelihood, get a job, support your family. 30, strength. 40, for understanding. Ben arba'im lebina. 50, for counsel. 60, sagacity. 70, elderliness, etc., etc., etc. The rest is old age. Not really. 40 is the age of bina, of understanding. Rashi, therefore, borrows the concept from that mission and says, well, here also when the Talmud says, what is the age when a person should, until when should a person not be ruling and influencing, and when should they be? Until 40 years means until you're 40 years old. Because when you turn 40 years old, you attain a new level, a new achievement of bina, of understanding. There was once a chassid of the Gerer Rebbe, and he was once very down, one Shabbat in Shul. And so the Rebbe turns to him, and he notices he's very down, and he says, why are you so down? What's wrong? So the chassid tells him, I'm a little anxious, I'm a little worried. Why? Because I'm soon turning 60. And if you notice the Mishnah says, well, in our version that I have printed here, it's 60 for sagacity and 70 for elderliness. But there's another version that switches it way around. 60 for elderliness and 70. So there's different versions. So he was quoting the other version. So he tells his Rebbe, the Mishnah says at 60, it's like zikna, it's like old age. I'm turning 60 soon. I'm a little depressed, I'm a little down that it's the Mishnah rules that I've attained old age. I'm becoming an old man. So the Rebbe comforted him. And he told him, don't worry, my friend. Just like the same Mishnah that ruled ben arba'in lebina, when you turn 40, you become an age of understanding. That's what the Mishnah says. But it didn't happen, it didn't work by you. So to the Mishnah that says when you're 16, you become old, that's also not going to happen. It's not going to work by you either. A good way of some kind of comfort. But that is the opinion of Rashi. 40 years old, we should be hiring leaders, rabbis, listening to people who are 40 years or older. The famous school of commentary called Tosfos means the additional commentary on the Talmud. Tosfos, which was a school of rabbis between the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century from Europe, in Spain, in France, in Italy. So they offer a complete different understanding. They reject Rashi's interpretation. It's not when you turn 40. That's not what it means. Rather, it means when you've had 40 years of experience of Talmud study, of Torah study. Until you've studied Torah for 40 years, you should not be the one that's issuing rulings and opinions and influencing the community. So in other words, what's the age? Meaning if you start studying Torah at 10, then perhaps only at 50, you can start to make halachic rulings. If you start studying Torah at 20, then maybe only at 60. Not like Rashi, which says the moment you turn 40 years old, you're eligible. But rather, you have to have 40 years of Torah study in order to be eligible. It's a very different opinion. There's the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ben arba'in lebina. It seems to be that the Mishnah is saying when you turn 40, you have a level of bina. So Tosfos says, I have a different Talmud to support my view. And he quotes the Talmud in Avodah Zarah, page 55a to b, quote source number 4 on your sheet. Let's learn it together. It's a really interesting piece of Talmud, and we're going to be getting into this thing really deep. Let's read it together. So the sages taught with regards to the verse in the Torah when Moses, in his last words in the book of Deuteronomy, is reflecting on the last 40 years with the Jewish people because they're about to pass away and then they're going to go into Israel. So Moshe says as follows. That God turned to the Jewish people after he gave them the Torah 40 years earlier by Sinai, and God said, who would give that they had such a heart as this always, to fear me, to keep all my commandments, that it might be good for them and with their children forever. God reached out to the Jewish people and he said, I've just given you a Torah. There's many laws. There's a very disciplined life I want you to live. And I understand it's going to be often a difficult life because you have a Yetzer Hara, you have temptations, you have inclinations, you have impulses that are often going to try to steer you away from living the disciplined, holy life that I've asked you to. So God is asking, who would give? What do you request? How are you going to be able to do it? To hold on to this calling that I've given you today when I give you the Torah. That's the question God posed, and he never got a response from the Jewish people back then, 40 years earlier. Now, 40 years later, before Moses passes away, Moses is reminding the Jewish people about this, and he comes down very hard on it. And he says Moses says to the Jewish people, ingrates, children of ingrates, You ungrateful nation, you ungrateful people. Thanksgiving is coming. Well, you are ungrateful. When the Holy One, blessed be, he said to the Jewish people, who would give that you had such a heart as this? Always God gave you an offer. He reached out to you. You should have responded. You should give us a heart to fear you. God, we can't do it alone. Please, you help us. Recognizing what God has done for you until now, you should have asked God. But instead, you refused to recognize what God had done to you. And therefore, you did not respond to God and get the help that you needed. Which is possibly why throughout the last 40 years, Moses is telling them, look how many times you failed. Look how many times you complained, you kvetched, you were in disbelief of God. Now, why is Moses only coming down hard on them now? I mean, he could have for the last 40 years, he could have 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, right away, he could have said, guys, reach out to God. He's giving you an offer. Be grateful for what you have. Why now? So the Talmud explains. Yet even Moses, our teacher, who said this to the Jewish people, did not allude to the Jewish people until after 40 years in the desert. How do we know this? Because he's speaking now. When's he speaking? So in his speech right now in Deuteronomy, he says, and I've led you in the wilderness for 40 years. So he's definitely talking about a speech 40 years later before he passes away, which shows that Moses was speaking 40 years after the revelation is signed. And what is it that Moses tells them? Listen carefully. And at this point, and I quote, I added in the long quote, the Talmud says the short quote, I added in the long quote. Here it says, and Moses called all of Israel and said to them, you have seen all that the Lord did before your very eyes in the land of Egypt, the great trials which your very eyes beheld, and those great signs and wonders. You saw the miracles. Yet until this day, the Lord has not given you a heart to know, eyes to see, ears to hear, in the Hebrew. Lo nasan Hashem lachem, leiv ladas, einayim liras, oznayim lishmoya. You haven't had the capacity to feel, to understand, to hear, to see. Your garment did not wear out upon you, nor did your shoes wear out upon your feet. You had all the miracles taken care of you throughout these past 40 years. Sichon, the king of Heshbon, Og, the king of Bashan, they came toward you in battle and you smote them. So Moses is reflecting on all the miracles and all the greatness, the manna fell from heaven, the water from the rock. You never turned to God with gratitude. And you never took it to heart, all these things. But why is Moses only berating them now? Now before he passes away. He could have spared them from this disgrace. And 40 years ago, 30 years ago, told them about this. No, you know why he waits till now? Because only now Hashem has given you a heart to know, eyes to see, and ears to hear. Only now. Why? Rabbi said, Rabbi concludes from this, conclude from here, that a person does not understand the opinion of his teacher until after 40 years. As Moses said this to the Jewish people only after 40 years of learning Torah. There's an amazing concept over here, and that is, when your teacher, when God, when somebody is teaching you, trying to influence you, when you're listening and you're understanding and you're accepting and you're absorbing and you're practicing, it takes 40 years to truly connect and understand what's being taught to you. Just like you know, there are often times that someone says something to you in life, and it didn't mean much to you. It didn't click. It didn't have any impact on you. And maybe many years later, when you were in a certain situation, a certain frame of mind, a certain time in your life, all of a sudden you reflect on what that person told you many years earlier, and you say, ha, whew, what a teaching, what a concept. Wow, now it really impacts me. So sometimes it takes time for something to kick in. Well, apparently the Talmud says, if you truly want to be able to understand, to absorb, to internalize, and to connect with the teachings of a teacher, it takes 40 years. This phrase that God has given you a knowing heart, seeing eyes, and hearing ears, to be able to truly absorb and internalize that which has happened to you, it takes 40 years. And so therefore, up until now, up until 40 years, Moses didn't berate the Jewish people. He didn't tell them what an ungrateful people you are, even though they were, but he couldn't blame them. Because it's true they'd seen all the miracles. It's true they'd seen all the wonders. But it didn't hit home. They didn't fully connect with it. So they can't be held so liable. But now, after 40 years, this is the moment. This is the period of time where now you are supposed to have connected with this after the 40 years of study and connection. Now you should realize what you have. Turn to God and be grateful. Tosfos commentary turns to this passage in Talmud and says, we see from here, it's not about turning 40 years old that's so significant. It's about having 40 years experience in studying has more significance, because only then do you truly attain the wisdom and connect with the knowledge and the information that's being imparted to you. And therefore, Tosfos argues with Rashi. Rashi says that a person at 40 years old can begin to be an influencer and a halakhic ruler and teach and inspire. Tosfos says, no. Only a person who has 40 years of experience can begin to do that. It might be at an older age, 50 or 60, like I said earlier. So what's going on over here? It's a very interesting argument. But what are we to make of it? Is there a conflict in the sources? The source in Pirkei Avot says, Ben arba'im lebina. 40 is the age of bina. 40 is the age of understanding, of maturity. The other Talmud says, not 40 years old, but 40 years experience. Which one is it? So the answer is as follows. Really interesting. There's two different concepts. There's two different achievements. Two different stages in human development that are being addressed over here. Rashi is referring to one, Tosfos is referring to the other. What are they? When the Mishnah teaches Ben arba'im lebina, when the Mishnah says at 40 years old you attain bina, that is talking about the development of human intellectual maturity. Your mind that God has blessed you with, it takes time to evolve, to mature, to develop, to truly integrate into your senses. At what point can you attain a level of maturity, a level of complete intellectual progress and integration into your life? At the age of 40. Because the age of 40 is when you attain bina. Let's talk about bina. What is bina? What is knowledge? What is intellect? Let's talk about this, because humans are supposed to have intellect. So we should know more about this, at least aspire for it. Really, if you look at it, starting from a very young age, there's really two traits in intellect. There's knowing and there's understanding. And the two can be very, very different. Typically, at a young age, that is the age of absorbing and growing in knowledge, but not necessarily understanding. Young children who may pick up words, language, pick up things being said around them, they can attain a lot of knowledge, but they don't really have a lot of understanding. Child doesn't really understand much, but they can know. They can know, they can accept, they can listen, they can hear, they can memorize, but not really understand. You know, it's a famous story of the joke. They say a child once came home one day and the father asked him, "No, how was school today?" And the child said, "Unbelievable. The teacher told us this amazing story and we had a great time." What was the story? So the student the child starts to tell the whole story. There was a hare, there was a tortoise, they were having a race. The tortoise is normally very slow, the hare is much quicker. So the hare was too confident in himself, he didn't start right away, he was relaxing, he was complacent, and in the end, the tortoise won. So the father realized that the child is memorizing the story that the teacher told him, but he doesn't know if he really understands it. So he asked his child, "Tell me, it's a great story. Do you know what a hare is?" Child says, "No." "Do you know what a tortoise is?" Child says, "No." So the father said, "Okay, so let me tell you the story, but a little differently. There was a rabbit and a turtle having a race." "Oh, the rabbit and turtle, but the rabbit's much faster than the turtle. The turtle's much slower. How did the turtle win the race?" "Oh, because the rabbit was overconfident and went." I understood the story. So children go along And I'm saying children, but it could happen to adults also. And that's part of the focus we need to have in growing up. Growing up maturity is not just learning to know things, but learning to understand things. Nowadays, knowledge is not such a challenge anymore. It used to be knowledge was a challenge. You have to get your hands onto a book, onto a newspaper, onto an encyclopedia. I remember when I was in school and I had a project on encyclopedias. My grandmother had a set of my grandparents, or the library went. Sorry. So once upon a time, access to knowledge was much more difficult. Today, knowledge is it clicks away on your screen on your phone. You could be accessing and reading and processing knowledge all the time. Today is a very different. Today is called the information age. It is because everyone has the information, but at the same time, it's also the misinformation age, because sadly we're being bombarded with a lot of misinformation, but also because when we have that information, but we don't know what to do with it and how to process it and how to truly understand it, it results in misinformation. The challenge today is to understand what's being said, what's being written. That's called the skill of bina. Bina is, as the Talmud says, lahavin davar mitoch davar, to understand, to be able to extrapolate, to infer, and to deduce. You're given a piece of information, right? If you take a child and you say, here's one apple, here's another apple, 1 and 1 equals 2 apples. The child knows that now. He can memorize it. 1 apple plus 1 apple equals 2 apples. Now ask him, if I gave you 1 candy and then another candy, how many candies do you have? He's not going to know the answer. Why? He knows apples. He doesn't have the understanding of the equation. They can therefore apply it in a different scenario. That's called bina. So that's a simple example. But for wiser people, similar thing. When you're studying, it could be Torah, it could be any other subject. You're reading something, you try to understand, you read a case study, a scenario. But can you infer from there? Can you extrapolate what is the principle? What is the logic? What is the reasoning? What's the rationale? What's the opinion? What's the motive going on over here? And once you can get into the heart of that, you can start to apply that in other cases as well. That's called bina. They say a story about a rabbi, and one day she was giving a class to his students, and one day a woman came into the room and she says, "Oh, you have a chicken," and they say, "Our last chicken, and we're very hungry at home. The shochet just slaughtered it, but we're not sure if it's kosher or not. Can you please check if it's kosher?" And she shows it to the rabbi, and he's looking at this chicken, and he notices that there's a little hole somewhere in its innards. So he starts to say to himself, "Well, I see there's a little hole in the innards, but the question is, this hole makes the chicken not kosher or not?" So he says, "It depends. If this belongs to the actual stomach, then the law is like this. If this is the intestine, the law is like this. If there's another organ of the innards, if the law is like this." And he's going through the whole Talmudic laws about it. At the end of this whole thing, she asks the question, "But is it kosher or not?" So he says, "Well, I told you, if it's the stomach, it's not kosher. If it's the intestines, it is kosher." So the students start to get nervous over here. The students say, "Rabbi, but what's the law of the chicken?" So he says, "I don't know. I don't know what this thing is. I don't know if it's a stomach or it's an intestine or something else. I know the law, but I have no idea about the actual reality facts on the ground." That's a level of intellectual immaturity. That means you haven't taken the concept and really explored it to its greatest depth, to its practical applications, to its ability to drive home actual results and actual knowledge in the real world. This is all a description of bina. This is something that we have to focus on much more. Even with grown-ups, sometimes I could be teaching a text or a verse in the Torah. We studied the Torah portion, so the verse says this. Okay, so you can read the verse, you understand it, you can translate it word for word. But now I have a question for you. Why? Or why does it say this when it could have said this? Or didn't we learn something else elsewhere? A lot of times the person will get stuck. I don't know. This is what it says. I didn't learn that. I know you didn't learn that. Nobody learned it. You have to think about it. That's bina. So at 40 years old, you attain bina. You attain that possibility, that maturity, that potential in your mind. Your mind is now mature enough to be able to achieve those tools of inference and deduction and analysis and application. So therefore Rashi says, that's enough. That's all you need to become a rabbi. You need to have that power of intellectual maturity. Tosfos argues and he says, no. That is not sufficient to be a rabbi, to be a halachic ruler. You need more than that. You know what else you need? The whole concept of being able to rule a law of the Torah. The question comes your way and you can actually study and analyze and infer and be able to apply a halachic decision to a new case in this world. That's a major responsibility. Where does a person get that power from? So our power is Kabbalah, which means tradition, received wisdom. We're not self-made people. We're not coming from an island somewhere, having loved the text on our own and deciding we know everything. That's the person you should be suspicious of. The strength and the weight and the authority of somebody nowadays is because of their teachers and the tradition being passed on. He learned from his teacher, who learned from his teacher, all the way to Moses. That was the idea of smicha, of rabbinic ordination. Ordination meant that one rabbi was passing on the tradition to the next rabbi. And the next rabbi was basically filling the shoes of the previous rabbi, which meant if somebody wants to carry authority in the community, they have to be somebody that's been heavily, thoroughly trained by the previous generation, by a sage, by a mentor. And at what point are you ready to take the place of that mentor? You have attained their knowledge, and you can now be the transmitter of that knowledge into your community and your world, as long as it takes to understand the wisdom that your mentor passed on to you. Well, how long does that take? We already learned. It takes 40 years of studying with your mentor to understand the knowledge that they've given you. It takes 40 years. Therefore, says Tosfos, you have to wait till you finish the 40 years of study. So Rashi and Tosfos are arguing, but now we understand the argument better. What skill, what tool do you need in order to be able to become that authority? There's the 40 of the Mishnah and the 40 of the Talmud. The 40 of the Mishnah is age 40. The 40 of the Talmud is experience of 40 years. Age 40 gives you the ability, the achievement of intellectual maturity. Rashi says that's sufficient. What it doesn't give you yet is the complete being a recipient, the reception of the wisdom and the tradition from the previous generations. That takes 40 years. Tosfos says that's what it requires for you to become the halachic ruler. So you have to wait 40 years of study until you can become that rabbi. Wow, time is flying. I wanted to tell you so much more over here. The truth is that it goes a little deeper, which I want to just spend a few moments on. And then I want to explore the spiritual, mystical insight behind all this. 40 years we talk about over here, right? God tells the people in the desert, only after 40 years did God give you a knowing heart, open eyes, hearing ears. It's a very powerful expression. It's not just that it takes 40 years to understand the teachings of your rabbi, of your mentor. Because the truth is, if you think about it, who says? And why is it 40 years for everybody? I mean, everyone's different. Some people are clever, more advanced. They can maybe attain all that knowledge in 30 years or 20 years or 5 years. And some people who are a little slower may need a whole lifetime. How do we give this arbitrary number of 40 years? 40 years of life skills and experiences, Gary says. Yeah. But if we're talking about the 40 years gives you the knowledge of your teacher, why is it 40? Maybe for some people it's 30, and for some people it's 50. So the Lubavitcher points out something extremely deep over here. It's much more than what we've suggested until now. It's not just it takes 40 years, and after 40 years of study, you have attained the knowledge of all of your mentor's wisdom. It's more than that. After 40 years of studying and immersing in the wisdom and the teachings of your mentor, you haven't just absorbed the knowledge they've imparted to you, you've actually become transformed with and into the mind of your mentor. Listen carefully. When your mentor, your teacher, your Rav, the person that's trained you, that's brought you into this world, that's given you the path in life, when they're teaching you, and that was very common, by the way, once upon a time, people learned by their mentor for years. Today in school or in college, I mean, every year, every semester, we're switching teachers. But it used to be you took one person who knew how to teach you about life and you spent the rest of life with him. When that mentor is teaching you, he's passing on two things to you. Overtly, he's passing on the knowledge. He's teaching you law, Talmud, Hashkafa, Jewish viewpoints, perspectives, whatever he's teaching you. But more than that, deeply embedded in his words and in his wisdom, he's conveying and he's imparting his own mind. His own mind meaning the way he thinks, his methodology, his insight, the depth of his connection with this wisdom. It's not just about the information, but it's about the whole Weltanschauung, the whole worldview, the whole perspective, the whole inclination and intuition of the Rav, of the teacher's mind. The ultimate goal for a student is not just to be able to receive the wisdom from the teacher, but a student should want to be able to emulate, become the teacher, becoming the teacher by attaining the teacher's mind. You know what happens then? Then it's not just that you're able to impart the wisdom the teacher gave you. It's more than that. Then you're actually able to start to think like your teacher. You can start to view the world like your teacher. You now have your teacher's mind inside you. It's an unbelievable idea. At 40 years old, like Rashi says, you have achieved the ultimate maturity of your own mind. Your mind is ready to start to learn and analyze and really understand. After 40 years of study and experience, your mind is ready to now attain the complete maturity and connection of your teacher's mind. In other words, in the case of the Torah, after 40 years, God tells the Jewish people, you are now ready to fully absorb and connect with the mind of God inside of you. When you saw all these miracles and you saw these wonders, up until now you've been like children. You've received them, you've been happy, you've been grateful, you haven't been grateful enough, whatever. But now that God has given you a knowing heart, open eyes, and hearing ears, now when you see the world, you see it the way God sees it. When you see what's happening around you, when you see your life, you see it the way God planned it. You're seeing with God's eyes and God's mind after 40 years, which is the goal. The goal is not to go to the Torah. The Torah tells me I must do this, therefore I will do this. That's called a command. Okay, a command. I'm commanded to do this. Either I do understand, I don't understand, I do want to, I don't want to, but I'm being told to, I'll obey. Deeper, a higher level, the ultimate level is I do this because I want to, because it's the right thing, because I recognize that it's the true path in my life. Not I'm being told. I recognize my mind has been conditioned, has changed, has shifted, has matured, that it now thinks like God. A very important idea. Because when any world events happen, right now, we had elections, we had pandemics, we had all kinds of things going on around the world. A very common question would be, to me as a rabbi, is what's the Torah's view about something? Yeah, what is God? Which is basically asking me, what's God's view about something? Now, on the one hand, the response is, I'm going to give you God's view. Go to God. I don't know. What I might try to do is turn to a text. I'll try to find a text. And the text should try to apply it. Okay. A true Torah person, a true person who's accomplished 40 years of immersion and studying God's Torah in Jewish way of life, they can actually tell you what God thinks. Be careful over here, because normally when people tell you that they're speaking in the name of God, run far away. But what I'm saying is when you wake up in the morning and you turn to the world around you and you look at what's going on and you're right away reacting, what is the nature of your reaction? What's the content of your reaction? Now, there may be reactions of fear, reactions of hope. How are you interpreting things? After 40 years, when you start to interpret things and you start to look at things and you're building your perspective about things, those perspectives are the ones that God wants you to have. You attained it not because you found the text, but not because you attained it because you think this way now. Your thoughts, your internal intuitions and inclinations and reaction system is thinking the way the Torah would want you to think. After 40 years, you attain that. And read Gary's comment. And then be able to teach and share the wisdom with others, and the tradition continues to the next generation. Exactly. And when can you be that bridge to pass on to the next generation? So Rashi says, at 40 years old, we can trust you already. You have the maturity of your own mind. Tosfos says, no, only after 40 years of experience. Then you have the maturity of your Rebbe's mind. You have the maturity of Torah's mind. You start to see things the way they are, the way they should be in their true perspective. That's a very powerful achievement. Why 40? What's this number 40? 40 is now the number that represents true transformation, true maturation, true evolution, true development into the ultimate level. You've gone from being child and infant and immature to being mentally mature. You've grown up. You're not just knowing, but you're also understanding, and you're internalizing and you're being able to apply. According to Tosfos, it's not just you've matured your own mind, but you've transformed and transcended yourself to be able to think like Torah thinks, like your Rabbi thinks. You've changed your mind entirely. 40 is the number that represents that. Why 40? So very briefly, some of you may know, if you've studied Chassidut and Kabbalah, you know that it's Olakah, okay? Olakah. You know that our physical world created over here is a offshoot, comes from the spiritual worlds. And the spiritual was created by God. So whatever happens up in the spiritual worlds eventually evolves in our world as well. We know there are 4 spiritual worlds: Atzilut, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, which is a complex description in a simplified way about the evolution of the creation. Atzilut is the very first stage of emanation, where godliness starts to emanate and evolve into some kind of being. And then the next world of Bria, it starts to become a real creation, which is a separate entity from the God entity. And then Yetzirah, the next world, is the world that takes on formation, where that separate entity starts to have its own shape, color, size, formation. And finally, the world of Asiya, it has a complete identity, and eventually into the physical world as we see it today. So because there are 4 spiritual worlds, the way that evolves into our world is that we find the number 4 is very significant in creation. For example, there are 4 different categories of creations. We talk about Domem, Tzomech, Chaim, Medaber. We have the inanimate mineral world, the rocks, the stones, earth, etc. We have the vegetable kingdom, trees, plants. We have Chai, the animal kingdom. And then we have the Medaber, the human species. So the world is in 4. And these actually refer and are evolved from the 4 worlds, which, by the way, the 4 worlds evolved from the 4 names of 4 letters of God's name. Yud, then Hey, then Vav, then Hey, are matching to, or they create the 4 different worlds, which create the 4 dimensions of creation here in this world. And we'll study this more at greater depth at different times. You also have 4 elements in all of creation, what the ancient Greeks, but the ancient Maimonides and the Torah understood, and the way it's interpreted nowadays is a little different, but you still have these 4 elements in all of creation. Fire, air, earth, and water is the makeup of all of existence. You also have the 4 most important, powerful forces of modern physics. We know there's gravity, electromagnetism, the weak force, the strong force. Again, there's a lot of these 4s that are coming into play in modern scientific phenomena. It's resulting from the 4 spiritual worlds. We have 4 seasons of the year, the cycle of the sun. We have 4 directions of the universe. Think about why it was created that way, with 4 directions. Again, the number 4. Now, these 4 worlds each contain 10 sephirot. These 4 worlds each contain 10 layers of manifestation, of evolution. Think about our own soul, because our soul is created in the image of God. Our soul also has the 10 sephirot, the 10 faculties, the 10 layers of evolution, starting with our subconsciousness, right? How do we get to from our subconsciousness, where things are in our inner source in our soul, and then they begin to be released into our consciousness? And what's the pattern of how things evolve through our system, through our persona? So first it's released into the consciousness, and then it goes into your mind, and you start to think about it and develop it and finally grasp it. So there's three elements of seichel, chachma, bin, dat. Once the mind completely understands and grasps something, it then starts to influence our emotions, how we're going to react and feel about it. So we have the 6 different kinds of emotions, the progression of this idea through our emotions. And finally, malchut, the final stage, is the output, how we're actually going to deal with this in a functional way, the things we're going to say, the things we're going to do as a result of this initial spark in our consciousness. So that's the flow of the 10 sefirot within our soul. Well, that's because every world has 10 sefirot and we come from there. So the 4 worlds each has 10 sefirot. That comes out to the number 40 if you think about it. So in a nutshell, 40 describes the complete passage, the complete achievement of a full evolution of something from its beginning, from its inception, all the way through till its end, till its maturity, till its transformation into resulting into what it can be. That's where the number 40 comes from. Therefore, think about some of our examples that we started off with, and we're running out of time, but 40. 40 is the number of purity. The waters of the mikvah are 40 sa'ah, or the 40 days and nights of the reign of Noah. A world that was in a state of deep impurity, or a person in impurity. And you want to go through this kind of transformation. You want to change. You want to be able to leave your previous state and grow into a new spiritual state. Number 40 is important to get you there. Moses is trying to receive the Torah, take the Torah from the heavens and bring it down to earth. Takes to number 40 to be able to make that shift, that radical change in the Torah. Or to be able to learn the Torah fully took Moses 40 days and 40 nights. The Jews who are slaves in Egypt and are trying to become a free people, and a people chosen by God to live as God's children and ambassadors in this world, and to enter the land of Israel and become a self-sovereign nation. It takes 40 years. That change, that shift required the number 40 to get to where it was. 40 categories of labor to construct the Mishkan, to construct the tabernacle. 40 lashes, where the lashes is somebody who has sinned. And this penalty is not just about punishing you because you're a bad person, but the Torah's penalties are about rehabilitating you, about changing you, about teaching you. Well, it takes the 40 lashes, 40 minus 1 in the language of the Torah, but it's the 40 lashes to bring you, to give you that education, to give it a state of elevation and transformation, to leave the state of a sinner to become to the state of somebody who's clean and ready to regret what they've done and accept a new life for themselves, a virtuous life. Again, the number 40. We're actually told "40 is the number that also gets us to the future redemption, the coming of Mashiach." Right? The Talmud says, the Rabbi Eliezer says, the Messianic era will be 40 years. And there's a source to quote this. What does that mean? So most come to understand it's not that it's just going to be 40 years and my life's going to be over, but the passage of time to enter into the true Messianic stage, into the true redemptive stage of the world, takes 40 years of maturation and transformation. 40 years until we begin the time of the resurrection and all of the promises that prophets have told us. It's not something you just walk into, because like the child needs to grow into an adult, like the mind needs to grow into a state of maturity, like the Jews needed to leave Egypt and then finally enter Israel, we enter the passageway into the era of redemption and world peace and true goodness and truth reigning in this world. Takes also the passage of 40 years. So let's summarize. We've learned a lot tonight. There's something really significant and magical about the number 40. We've learned that 40 defines the journey of development and the journey of maturation and the journey of becoming something new, like a rebirth, or discovering your true potential and fulfilling your true destiny and mission here in this world. Whether it's 40 years old, or whether it's 40 something else in your journey, there's all kinds of customs people have. They want to find the shidduch, they go to Israel, they do 40 days around something, or 40 fasts. Everyone has There's different customs about this. But think about how that number 40 is getting you there. You were born through the number of 40. 40 days till your conception, 40 weeks till you were born. Very powerful. So personally, I hope that by turning 40, I can actually have a taste, a glimpse of that which Rashi describes, of this kind of intellectual maturity that's being described in the Mishnah. I wish, I'm trying my best. But more importantly, what I can do with that, what I hope to do with that. And I'm with your help and with your blessings and with your partnership, and I'm blessing this to you also. I have to use this journey of ours and this path of ours in life to be able to grow and go further. The fact is, we're talking about this level of maturation. The greatest, most important thing in life is not what you've gained, it's not what you've achieved, but it's where you're going and it's where you're heading. You've always got to be on the journey. Anyone who stops, you may stop your life at 30, you may stop your life at 70. What do you have? You got so much more to go still. Every day is another day, another opportunity to be more curious, to learn more, to grow. And as we've learned, to enter the realm of Natan Hashem Lachem, God should give you, God bestows upon you a great gift. It's the gift of a knowing heart, seeing eyes, hearing ears, to be able to view the world as it truly is, not as our immature, insecure mind and heart want to tell us. We want to, judge things the way we want to interpret them, and grow up. At the age 40, it's time to grow up and appreciate things for who they are, appreciate people for who they are, appreciate reality for what it is, learn about how everything is a force, is an ingredient in your life that can bring you to where you're supposed to be bigger and better than you've ever imagined. That's my goal. That's my blessing to all of you. God should bless you, l'chaim, on this cup of water that I have, and we should merit to see, to feel, to hear the way the Jews did back then, to go into the land of Israel, to enter our own lands of Israel, the state of truth, clarity, and may you all be blessed with all good things. L'chaim, God bless you. Good night. Thank you for joining. Same time, same place, next week.